Morning, my name is Andrew Elefant, and I'm the Director of Legal and Policy at Kittyhawk.io. Thanks for joining me for this morning's webinar, Enabling Advanced Operations with BVLOS Waivers. So to give you an idea of what we'll be discussing this morning, we're going to give a little bit of an overview about BVLOS operations in general, what type of waivers you might need, and which sections of Part 107 you might need to request a waiver for to operate beyond visual line of sight. Some types of BVLOS operations, and then we're going to get into the next phase of the IPP called Beyond, which is actually going to be focusing on beyond visual line of sight operations. So let's go ahead and dive right into it. So first, what are BVLOS operations? And I'm going to use that shorthand because saying beyond visual line of sight operations takes a long time. So the common way to refer to this is BVLOS. And so in general, if you can't see your in-flight small UAS with unaided vision, you're flying beyond visual line of sight. And I'll explain this in a little bit more detail in a moment, but that has to do with the provisions of Part 107, specifically Part 107.31 and .33. So the next question is, why would you want to fly BVLOS? And the three of the main types of BVLOS operations are exactly why you would want to fly beyond visual line of sight. So things like drone delivery, infrastructure inspection, and public safety, they potentially need the ability to fly beyond visual line of sight, either to deliver packages, inspect infrastructure, especially linear infrastructure where you're flying long distances, or for public safety reasons. In a fire or a search and rescue situation, beyond visual line of sight operations could really help control a situation like a fire that needs to have eyes on it without really considering whether you're flying visual line of sight or beyond visual line of sight. And here at the bottom are a couple of key terms, because as with everything in aviation, there's a lot of acronyms, and it's important to know exactly what you're referring to. So things like beyond visual line of sight is shorthanded to BVLOS. You'll hear me talk about a VO, which is a visual observer, and you'll also might hear me discuss some terms like see and avoid and detect and avoid. And also, lastly, there's something that I'll get into called extended visual line of sight, which is also pretty commonly put into shorthand as EVLOS. So a lot of acronyms, a lot of shorthand, but please refer back to this if you do need additional information about any of these terms. So as I mentioned in the previous slide, beyond visual line of sight operations under Part 107 without a waiver are actually very limited. And this is because of, as I mentioned, two specific portions of Part 107. So Part 107.31 lists the requirements for visual line of sight operations. And Part 107.33 lists the requirements for using a visual observer. So the reason why these two work together and why I'm mentioning them at the same time is that Part 107.31 basically says you need to maintain visual line of sight of your small unmanned aircraft while you are flying under Part 107. Now, both of these, Part 107.31 and Part 107.33, both of these are waivable. So you can request the FAA to operate without following these provisions, but you have to submit a waiver. And if you don't, it's really difficult to put together a beyond visual line of sight operation while still complying with the rest of Part 107. And part of this is because Part 107.31 says that someone in your group, your flight team, either the remote pilot in command or a visual observer, someone needs to be able to, with unaided vision, keep the small unmanned aircraft in its sights and also be able to view the area around. And that's why I referred to earlier as see and avoid. And then Part 107.33 goes and lists the requirements for if you are to use a VO, which you do have to do in Part 107.31, Part 107.33 tells you how to do it, and what type of operations and what type of activities your visual observer needs to do. So when you're talking about BVLOS waiver requests, probably the majority of them are strictly waiving 107.31, which basically allows a BVLOS operation with a visual observer. So that's just a straight 107.31 waiver. However, there's also a really common type of combination waiver that the FAA has issued to multiple companies, which are essentially a combination waiver of Part 107.31 and Part 107.33. These are the type of even more advanced operations that essentially allow for BVLOS operations without a visual observer. And the reason that I mention this is because the different parts of Part 107 work together in different ways, and you can get creative about asking for waivers from specific sections of Part 107. And so there are multiple ways to go about receiving a waiver for BVLOS operations. And a good part of that has to do with just the complexity of your operation. If you can do your operation with a VO, I would suggest you do that because it's going to be a simpler waiver and it's going to be a lot less complicated operationally. But I bring this up to show that there are multiple ways of achieving a BVLOS waiver, and they really run the scale of complexity from relatively simple BVLOS operations to much more complex. So really, there's a big divide in terms of beyond visual line of sight operations at the current moment. So as I mentioned earlier, without a waiver, realistically, you can really only do what's known as extended visual line of sight. And that is essentially using a VO to keep track of the aircraft while it's in flight. But that VO has to be in constant contact with the remote piloting command. And so it basically extends your line of sight. It doesn't actually let you operate beyond line of sight because it will be in someone's sight, whether that's the remote piloting command or the VO. But with a waiver, you can fly beyond visual line of sight with certain limitations. And to switch gears for a moment, I think it's important to mention that some of these waivers and some of these beyond visual line of sight operations are utilizing technology and automation to help them fulfill some of the requirements of Part 107. And these are things like onboard detect and avoid, so computer systems that can fulfill the function of a visual observer looking to the environment and detecting and avoiding other aircraft. But that's not the only way to do it. A lot of folks use specific procedures, personnel, planning, and just strategically using their resources. And they're also able to perform beyond visual line of sight operations. So the take-home message here is that there's really not just one way to do this, and it is really very specific to your operation. The other part that's worth mentioning is that a lot of you are probably familiar in the news with big companies like UPS and Wing and Amazon and others who want to do drone delivery, and especially want to do drone delivery at scale. And so that means nationwide or large volumes of flight. And here, these companies are operating mostly outside of Part 107 completely, and they're utilizing another section of the regulations called Part 135 in order to let them do large-scale drone delivery. And so this is an interesting place to watch because some of the drone delivery news that will be coming out in the next year or so because of beyond what I'm about to mention, it's important to know that there is another pathway for more complex operations, and that can utilize things beyond Part 107 because there are things that you can't do with Part 107, but a large majority of the operations should be able to be performed with Part 107 or a waiver, unless you're in kind of a different category altogether, which is these large companies that are doing Part 135. And it is worth noting that Part 135 operations requires a lot of time and resources just to be approved. So this isn't really appropriate for a smaller operation. Those operations are going to probably be done under Part 107 or under a waiver to Part 107. When you're filling out a waiver for a BVLOS operation, or even just when you're considering how to do a BVLOS operation while making it safe and doing it in a safe way that the FAA is going to look kindly upon in your waiver application, these are three things that are important considerations for if you're thinking about doing a BVLOS operation. So first is operating environment, because as with all other Part 107 operations, you're going to need extra safety mitigations if you're, for instance, not operating in a closed environment. If you're going to be flying over people, that's an entirely separate regulation that you're going to need to mitigate in addition to the beyond visual line of sight portion of it. And then with your operating environment, your launch and land location is really important, because you're going to need to do things like access control and really think through how your operation is going to, what it's going to look like out in the real world, especially if you're not doing it on private property, for instance. Another key consideration is just the experience and expertise of your flight team. So, you need to put together a team primarily for doing BVLOS operations. You're going to have to be doing it with a flight team. So more likely than not, you're going to need to use a visual observer unless you've done a Part 107.33 waiver that allows you to not use a visual observer. But it's very difficult to do a BVLOS operation with one person. So you will need multiple people, and those people are going to need to have the right experience. And as with all advanced operations, you're going to need appropriate training and planning for both completing your waiver and operationally. So things like an operations manual, a training manual, ways of flight planning, and things that you are going to do prior to every operation. And this type of information is important to know kind of while you're thinking about whether or not a BVLOS operation is right for the challenge that you're trying to deal with. And then last but not least, I referred to this in another slide, but really consider what you're trying to accomplish and whether you're going to be better off using technology or using what I would call more old school methods, like planning and processes and a safety management system, things like that will allow you to perform these operations in the safest possible way while using the right tools for the job. So some technology that you utilize might be just too far beyond what you're looking to do. And when in doubt, try and keep it simple. Added complexity is something that you have to mitigate. So that's important to keep in mind. And lastly, I wanted to talk a little bit about why you're going to be hearing a lot more about beyond visual line of sight operations in 2021. So for those of you who are familiar, the FAA had a program called the Integration Pilot Program that ran from 2017 until October 2020. The next phase of the IPP is called Beyond. And that's done on purpose. It's specifically focused on beyond visual line of sight operations. And the core goals of it are basically trying to allow those three types of operations that I mentioned at the start under established rules instead of waivers. So things like infrastructure inspection, public operations, public safety, and small package delivery, those are going to be the focus of the next phase of the IPP, and part of what will be done and beyond, in addition to what we'll be doing with Beyond, in addition to scalable BVLOS operations like drone delivery and infrastructure inspection. But this will also go to a key consideration of beyond visual line of sight operations and advanced operations in general, and just scaled drone operations happening increasingly at scale. This will also take into account quantifying some of the economic benefits of these UAS operations and taking the time to engage with the community and alleviate community concerns. Because as these operations become more commonplace, you'll have some community concerns that will need to be addressed and alleviated. So Beyond is going to be a very exciting program, especially if you're interested in beyond visual line of sight operations, because Beyond really could turbocharge how BVLOS operations are both conducted and also applied for with waivers. But one of the things that I'm excited about Beyond is the focus on operating under established rules instead of waivers, because waivers are great, but they do take a lot of time and a lot of effort. And if we can move to a place where we're using established rules rather than waivers, it's going to be a lot less complicated to safely operate your drone program, and it's just going to generally make it easier to know how to comply with the rules. So with that, thank you for joining us for this waiver webinar on beyond visual line of sight operations and waivers. If you want to follow up, and if you have any additional questions after this presentation, feel free to follow up with me directly. I'm Andrew at kittyhawk.io. So thank you for joining us. Well, while we're waiting for any questions that come in, I think one thing that I found interesting during the polling during the presentation is that reliability of small UAS is actually thought to be one of the bigger concerns for community acceptance. So I think that's interesting because that's actually not one of the more frequent ones that I hear about. So actually, I have a couple of questions that have rolled in. So first, how do BVLOS waivers currently differ for drones in excess of 55 pounds? The answer to that question is, for drones that are in excess of 55 pounds, you're operating outside of Part 107, because Part 107 only applies to small UAS 55 pounds and below. So you're not going to be operating in Part 107, so you're not actually going to be utilizing or seeking out waivers in the traditional process via the drone zone. And so that's, I think that's the easiest way to answer your question, is you're not necessarily going to be able to utilize the existing waiver process, because you need to make sure that you're operating within Part 107. Let's see what other questions have come in. Another question: tips on obtaining a BVLOS operation or waiver. I think it's a pretty complicated, complex process that I'm trying to shine some light on, and I think a lot of folks are utilizing BVLOS waivers more, so there is more information out there on how to do it. And I think that's one thing that you'll see more content about moving forward, is how to approach very specifically BVLOS waivers through the drone zone. Oh wow! All the questions are coming in now. So I think one interesting question that I saw is, what do you suggest to concerns on privacy? And I think the best answer that I have for that is just in terms of alleviating the concerns of folks in the community for operations that you're doing. In general, I would say that transparency and being as open and upfront and transparent about what you're doing is going to be a good method of respecting people's privacy, and also having them think that you're doing the right thing, which kind of has the the effect of kind of a virtuous circle of the public knows that there are responsible operators out there, and therefore they're more likely to not think twice or not be concerned about drones operating in their vicinity. So I did see one question about law enforcement, and they're currently exploring BVLOS. They said they have a very active program and fly daily, and they have issues where they fly briefly beyond visual line of sight. So one thing for the public safety folks that are listening to this is one of the innovations that has happened in 2020 is something called the tactical beyond visual line of sight waiver. To my knowledge, that's only been achieved by one police department, but it has been used as kind of a method and a template as for those who might be utilizing drones beyond visual line of sight in a more law enforcement type of situation. So if you're looking for more information about BVLOS from a law enforcement perspective, I would take a look at the tactical BVLOS waiver. So I think that's a good place to start if that's perhaps what you're involved with. I think one additional question that I see is, what is your opinion on how remote ID will affect BVLOS? And I think remote ID will have an effect on BVLOS. I think it's going to have an effect on a large proportion of the industry. And I actually think that remote ID is probably going to make BVLOS operations easier and potentially easier to do without a waiver. Because if you have the ability to track and identify the drone while it's in the air, then not only does the community feel more comfortable with those operations, but if you can identify the drone, I think it's more likely that you'll be able to do beyond visual line of sight operations without a waiver, because that part of the equation has been addressed. So definitely watch that space. There's going to be some really interesting interaction as the remote ID rule gets finalized and rolled out in the new year, with also this new focus on beyond visual line of sight operations. So I think that's a great question, and that intersection is going to be a really interesting area to watch in 2021. One question from Ian: do you require a COA to obtain a BVLOS waiver? Not necessarily. You can get a BVLOS waiver without getting a COA, and those are kind of two different things. A COA is to operate for a public agency, whereas a BVLOS waiver is an operational waiver. So kind of two different things, but I understand that kind of where they could be utilized either at the same time or kind of supplementally. Any other questions? So one person asked, what are some of the waiver risk mitigation bullets to consider when submitting for a BVLOS waiver? And that's a great question. I think, as I addressed in the presentation, you're definitely on the right track just in terms of starting point of what risks am I potentially going to encounter and how am I going to mitigate them. I think that's the best way to approach any waiver application to the FAA. I think some of the waiver risk mitigation bullets to consider. One is your operating environment. I mean, the easiest way to mitigate risk is to make sure that your operating environment has little to no possibility of adding additional risk or adding any unknowable or unanticipated events. So I think that really thinking through where you're going to be operating, what sort of activities you're going to be doing out there is important. And then the other half of that, which I think is also very important in terms of risk mitigation for a BVLOS waiver, are just all of the background and foundational work that you're going to do to run this operation and run your drone program safely. And those are things like flight planning, personnel training, All of these behind the scenes foundational type of things are really important. One, to just show that you have an understanding and a mastery of those topics, but also to understand how to mitigate those. So I think those are kind of the two main areas that I would look at are just operationally, and also what you can do right off the bat, and what you can do in terms of training, studying. I think those are two really good places to start. Great. Well, since I don't see any other questions, I think I'm going to wrap it up here. But again, thank you very much for joining us this morning. I hope that this was educational and entertaining at the same time. And again, feel free to follow up directly with me. I'm Andrew at kittyhawk.io. So again, thank you for joining us, and have a good rest of your day.